Yes, this is all in the context of the celebration of Russian emigration, and we three are going to talk about the members of the Pasternak family who emigrated and ended up in England. And just to start with, these are the founders of that particular generation. So Leonid Pasternak on the left, the artist who painted this self-portrait and portrait of his wife, and Rosalia Pasternak, his wife, my grandmother, who was a concert pianist. She gave her first public performance in a concert hall in Odessa at the age of 8. The recordings we do have suffer from the limitations of recording in the 1930s, but we thought we ought to give you a little bit of a taste of her. And can I have the next picture, please? These are the 4 children of those parents on the occasion of Leonid and Rosalia's silver wedding anniversary. So they are celebrating and bringing flowers to their parents. In the front is their eldest son, Boris. Behind him in green is the elder daughter, Josephine. After her in pink is the youngest child, Lydia, who is our mother. And then last is Alexander, our uncle Shura, bringing up the rear. In 1921, that family was broken up. Leonid and Rosalia, the parents, needed to leave Russia for a whole number of reasons. After the revolution, after the civil war, there were immense privations and a certain degree of hunger, and they also needed medical attention. My grandfather was afraid that he was going blind. He suffered from cataracts, and his wife had heart trouble, so they needed to go abroad to Germany to get medical attention. In the next generation, Boris and Alexander, the 2 sons, had reasonably established positions, but the 2 daughters, who were much younger, needed to attend, or wanted to attend university. And as members of a bourgeois family in young Soviet Russia, they would, either had great difficulties or probably simply not been able to attend a university. So Leonid and Rosalia, Josephine and Lydia emigrated to Germany. And of course the hope was that they would return to Russia after some years, but in fact only Lydia ever did, and that was 40 years later. Now Josephine was the first of them to leave, to enroll at the University of Berlin, and she left in the summer of 1921. And this is the sort of farewell photograph of the remaining Pasternak family. Leonid in the front with Alexander here. This is grandmother Berta, who is Rosalia's mother. And then at the back, Boris and Lydia. Josephine isn't on that photograph because she had already left. Now, the ones who left, can I have the next one? This is the converse, this is the sort of arrival photograph taken in Berlin, Leonid and Rosalia, Josephine in front, Lydia at the back. They lived in Berlin. Josephine and Lydia then moved to live in Munich. They lived there till the mid-1930s, and when they had to flee from the Nazis, it was Lydia's English husband, Eliot Slater, my father, who helped the whole family, by then that was 7 people, to escape to London. And with the approach of war, they all moved to Oxford, where Josephine and her husband bought themselves a home. Lydia lived in Eliot Slater's parents' home in Oxford. And we are now going to talk about the Pasternaks who settled in England, where we were all born. Michael will be telling you about Josephine, and then I will go on to talk about Lydia, and Anne will conclude with Leonid the painter. And sadly, all we can offer you about the 4th one, Rosalia, was the recording that you've just heard. Thank you. Michael.
Yes, okay. Just a tiny comment on the picture you've just seen of the silver wedding presentation of gifts to their parents by the 4 children. Nicholas mentioned the flowers the 2 of them brought. The 3rd brought a bowl of fruit, but Boris at the front brought a celebratory poem that he had written and that he read out to his parents. I would like to start with a memoir that Josephine wrote late in her life about her own youth, particularly her internal life between the ages of 13 and maybe 25. This was a psychologically penetrating study, rigorously objective, lucid, unsentimental, written in fluent, even eloquent language, but the language was English, her 3rd language. She was a native Russian speaker. Her 2nd language was German, learnt at school. Her 3rd language was English, also learnt at school. But she was also taught French at school, and as a teenager, she devoured voraciously the classics in all 4 languages. There is a note in passing in the book that I'm talking about to say that at the age of 13 she had read La Nouvelle Héloïse by Rousseau in mid-18th century French. Her account starts on the first day of a holiday in the Russian countryside in the year 1913. She was born in 1900, so it's easy to reckon her age if I tell you the year. All Russians love their own countryside, maybe more than any other nation, and if they can possibly manage it, they spend as much as possible of the summer in the countryside, in what is called a dacha, which can be anything from a hut to a palace. The Pasternaks loved to spend the summer, as much of the summer as they could, which meant from the end of May till early in September. Josephine was mortified each year when her father insisted on staying on towards the middle of September, and they would arrive back to Moscow for her to find that she was a week or 2 weeks late for the start of the academic year at school. Their dacha was a very grand one, but they didn't have the whole of it. They had rented rooms, and there were 4 other families in the same dacha, which was an 18th century hunting lodge built about 50 miles south of Moscow for Catherine the Great, a very grand house standing in its own grounds. On this first day of their arrival, for the first time in 1913, Josephine woke early to look out of the open window and see the early morning sun breaking across the grounds, the estate of this near palace, and the beautiful Russian countryside beyond it. She was enchanted, carried away by the beauty of the scene, and not just what she could see, but what she could hear, the dawn chorus starting, getting stronger and stronger, and then dying away bit by bit until there were only a few separate drops of glittering raindrops of sound from the last remaining blackbirds. I think Josephine had a certain synesthesia. She could hear the sounds of the birds, but it came to her, as I just said it, as glittering drops of rain falling through the cool air. And not just the sights and the sounds, but also the smells. She went out, she could smell through her open window the smells of the wild flowers in the fields. And when she went out a little later that morning and walked in the grounds, she walked into the woods and could smell the leaf mold and what Russians call gribui, for which there is no English equivalent. Mushrooms are just one sort, and there are dozens of sorts that the Russians love, and many of which they eat. It was not just the natural landscape which enchanted Josephine, but also music, and especially the music of her mother. What you heard a moment ago was, as Nicolas said, a very pale version of the reality because of the primitive state of recording in Germany in 1933. But it is the universal testimony of all four of Rosalia's children that her piano playing was something more wonderful than any they heard at any later time in their life. They could listen to superb pianists with technique as good as hers, but none who could convey the same sweet nobility that carried them away and brought tears to their eyes whenever they heard her. She was not only very sensitive to sights and to sounds, but also to literature. Her elder brother Boris, 10 years her senior, was already an established poet when she was a teenager. He valued her opinion of his poetry above that of anyone else and discussed it with her as to an adult. Now, not only was she overwhelmed with the aesthetic experiences of the natural world, she was also deeply moved by other people. The word sympathy could be applied in its original sense, to her, more than to most of us, sympathy means suffering with. If she came across a person who was suffering physically, mentally, morally, spiritually, she would suffer with that person. There was a terrible occasion for this sympathy the year after the year 1913, which I've just referred to. It was the start of the Great War in August 1914. Soldiers wounded or traumatized were sent back from the front, many of them to Moscow, some of them to Josephine's school, the Great Hall of which was converted into a nursing post. Teachers and the senior pupils tended to these wounded and traumatized people. Josephine, who throughout her life was a deeply religious person, would pray to God that he would stop somehow this horrible war. She prayed with great intensity, but she had the strong feeling that praying was all very well, but would God listen to her? She was a sinful person. God would not listen to a sinful person. She would have to expiate her sins. She thought of it as sinful that she could be carried away by beauty the way she was, because, for example, in that first episode that I described, she felt in her dacha as though she was in a sort of paradise and close to God. And this, she felt, was selfish. By being so close to God, she was excluding everybody else, and this was not fair on them. Later, she had an even stronger sense of sin because of her budding sexuality. She discovered how she could bring herself to a sexual orgasm by purely mental means, no self-physical stimulation, just by entertaining imaginary scenes. She didn't know the facts of life, but she felt somehow not only intense pleasure and a great release of tension when she behaved in this way, but also shame and self-disgust. It was something for which she needed to make some expiation to God. God would not listen to her prayers, intense as they might be, if she could not purify herself by penance and expiation. The penances she invented, or she felt that they were imposed on her, but of course she was actually inventing them herself. They were painful, time-consuming, even sordid. I will describe one such. She set herself the goal of staying awake for 36 hours, from waking up on one day to midnight on the following day. The first day was, of course, easy enough. The night was not easy because her bedroom adjoined her parents' bedroom, and the door between them was kept open. so she could not have a light and therefore could not read. She therefore had to keep herself awake purely by the thoughts that she had, disciplined thoughts that she had throughout the night. She succeeded on a number of occasions with lasting through the night, but the killer was the next day. She could start off, but sooner or later, during the course of that day, she would fall into a micro-sleep of just a few seconds, and just a few seconds was all it took for the whole project to be aborted. It wouldn't count if she couldn't account moment by moment for exactly what she was doing or exactly what she was thinking in the immediately preceding moment. When she failed, as she kept doing in this crazy scheme, she would give herself a week to catch up on her sleep debt and then try again and fail again. She was entirely lucid about what was going on. She knew that this was all crazy, but she couldn't resist it. She was helpless in the grip of these neurotic obsessions. I've only described one of them, there were many others. Nevertheless, in due course, she came to finish her school career. She was awarded a gold medal, as before her had both of her brothers, and as after her would her younger sister. Her fellow pupils loved her. She would help them with their problems. She was a superb mimic and would mimic the teachers to their great pleasure. She would mimic everybody. The teachers loved her because she was a star pupil. When she finished school, all the teachers said to her that she would undoubtedly become a writer, a great writer, because they could judge from the quality of her essays and compositions. But there was a catch. She couldn't become a writer in her own mind, because in the summer of 1916, at that same dacha that I've described before, in the middle of a beautiful summer day, enveloped by this heady scent of the linden blossom, she thought, I must record all this wonderful beauty. And she took up pen and paper, and then she had the sensation of a stern voice, the voice of God, saying to her, put down that pen, put down that paper. It would be a sin for you to continue. You must not write. She said in a tremulous voice, forever? Can I never write? Back came the implacable reply, never. Of course, she had to write school work, but that was all right. That was prescribed. It was something she had to do. She interpreted this prohibition to mean that she could never write for her own pleasure. She could never publish anything that she wrote. She was allowed to write letters to her friends, and that was all. At the end of her school career, tormented by her inner demons, and she had other frailties. She sometimes had panic attacks. She would have the most violent reaction to seeing a mouse, which of course one often did in the countryside. She sometimes had a feeling which she called in trauma, of a sort of unreality. She could function, but she somehow had the overwhelming feeling that the world in which she was working and functioning was a dream world, was not the real world. And episodes like this could last for hours at a time. When she finished school, she found things very difficult. She didn't psychologically. Materially, she was fine. Her parents did well. Her parents loved her. Her brothers and sister loved her. She was cocooned in love by her family. But she was losing most of her school friends, and she felt that the routine, the discipline of school was one of the things that kept her sane. If she wasn't constrained by the socially acceptable norms and rules of the world in which she lived, she would, as it were, go off the rails and invent all sorts of rules and restrictions and obsessive little rituals and penances, of course kept entirely secret. And the school was one of the things that allowed her to stay sane, and once she had left school, she was deprived of that. She didn't know what to do next, but she was very attracted by philosophy and enrolled, as it became possible to do at that time in 1917, in the Moscow school. However, not in philosophy. Although that was what she wanted to do, her brother advised her that she should study science and mathematics. Philosophy was completely useless. She had no natural aptitude for science or mathematics, and therefore, in her own perverse way, take the harder route, take the route that I do not wish to take. That was what she enrolled to do. She had great difficulty in following the lectures, but it didn't last long, because following the encouraging revolution of February 1917 came the Bolshevik coup d'etat in November, the so-called October, so-called revolution, after which everything fell into chaos, into civil war, into something close to mass starvation, into epidemics of typhoid and the Spanish flu, into a nightmarish expansion of an incomprehensible bureaucracy. For the years after the revolution, it was not possible to live a normal life. A Russian, and in particular her father, could say, like the French aristocrat who was asked what he had done years after the French Revolution of 1792, he said, "J'ai survécu." And that was all they could do. I will therefore skip the huge majority of the things that I was going to say. She went to Berlin, as my brother told you. She married, I won't tell you about that. She lived in Munich. She moved to Oxford. She had a nervous breakdown, and then another one. Finally, and she had a final nervous breakdown after her father's death in 1945. But after that, she had a whole half of her life living in a small house in the outskirts of Oxford. Her sister Lydia lived about 3 miles from her, and they would telephone each other every day. What did she do? Her children had grown up. The first thing she and her sister did was to try to re-establish her father's reputation. He had never established a reputation in England the way he had done in Russia and in Germany. Lydia and Josephine performed a remarkable feat. They themselves were outsiders and foreigners in getting him to be recognized by the English establishment. Nicolas will talk about that in his talk about Lydia. That was one thing she did. Another thing she did was to bring her father's papers into some sort of order. Her father wanted to record, before he died, all the fascinating meetings, friendships he had had with remarkable people in all walks of cultural, academic and political life. Josephine managed to get a selection of these papers published in the Soviet Union around 1970 by a publishing house called Sovietsky Hudozhnik, Soviet artist. This memoir of her father's is called Записи разных лет, writings from various periods. She then, and it's a typical Soviet publication, grey print on grey paper with grey illustrations. She then arranged for an English version. It was partly translation and partly further extracts from her father's writings that the Soviet censor would not have passed, and beautifully illustrated. A lot of the illustrations are in colour. These were the two things she did as family piety. She also reverted to her first love of philosophy, and in her own turn left a huge mass of papers, this time typescripts and in English, which her daughter Helen brought into some sort of order and had published with the title Indefinability. I don't have any time to say anything about indefinability. Towards the end of her long life, she spent most of her time in prayer. She joined the Anglican Church, and I remember on one occasion her telling me with a faint smile on her face, I talked to the parish priest all afternoon yesterday about the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine that says there is one God, but in 3 persons. She wouldn't have done this as a mere intellectual exercise. She really wanted to come close to God and understand as much as she could about God. She said, the parish priest offered me the analogy of a fork with 3 tines. I did not find this analogy very helpful. I would like finally to speak of her poetry. When she was living the life of a wife and a mother in Munich, she found an outlet for her creative energies in writing poetry in Russian. Russian poetry has always profited from the resources of meter and of rhyme. Unlike the fashionable English poetry of the 1930s, Josephine adhered to this tradition, which goes back to Pushkin and before. She published a selection of her poems in 1938, having freed herself of the constraint of not being allowed to write that she had imposed on herself in 1916. This book is called Coordinati, Coordinates, and was published under a pen name, Anna Ney. Is there a glass of water? Yes, there is. I've chosen one poem from it to read to you. It is apparently a light-hearted, joyous poem, but there is a sting in the tail, and if you have appreciated what I said about the constraints of society being something that she welcomed, one could misquote scripture. Its burden is light and its yoke is easy. She was much happier with the accepted constraints of the outside world than with those she imposed on herself. And this poem, I think, is her way of expressing that thought in poetic language. В поезде лиловые пашни и серые тучи, и клочья зеленых лесов, и ленится сердце, и мысли не мучат, баюкает поезд без слов. Душа без заботы, в беспечности сладкой железнодорожных кривизн. Какое блаженство, когда без остатка на рельсы поставлена жизнь. She published a second selection from the 1930s poems, in 1981, this time published by YMCA Press in Paris, which publishes a lot of émigré Russian literature, and under her own name. I was going to choose a poem from this book.
Mikey,
yes?
You're going on too long.
This is the very last thing I'm saying. But instead of a poem, I would like to read the dedication to this book. The book is called Pameti Pedro. Pedro was a dog owned by her son Charles, and he left the dog behind when he took up a one-year post in an American university. This is Josephine's sympathy with all creation, not just with human beings. Тебе, Петро, посвящаю свою вторую книгу стихов. Тебе, потому что никто никогда не посвящал тебя ничего. Тебе, прекрасное, безгласное существо, любившее лучше, чем можем мы, люди. Тебе, погибшему от тоски, когда твой хозяин уехал надолго, не мог взять тебя с собой и отдал другому. Тебе, умершему от разрыва сердца, когда ты понял, что вы разъединены навсегда. Тебе, в душе которого, казалось, сливались страдания всех мучимых. После.